Hey guys, good morning. All right, everyone settle in. Put your phones in the phone pockets. We are going to start a new unit today. Good morning, good morning, good morning. All right. So, over the next couple weeks, we are going to be studying the civil rights movement. And what I wanted to do was I put together a quick PowerPoint to talk about what we're going to be going in depth over the next couple weeks. I know that some of you are a lot more visual, and this way, this can kind of give you this is basically like a prequel to what we'll be looking at, about the civil rights movement. And actually, I will be sharing this with you guys. You guys can use this for your notes, to study for the tests, for the assessment that's going to be at the end of the unit. So let me start and share my screen here. One moment. Here we go. And obviously, this will, coincide with exactly what's going on in the textbook. So we'll be, looking at, what the chapters say, and also we'll be using, various other forms of information throughout this unit. So the civil rights movement, it's a very important part of history. It was about people fighting for fairness and justice. And for this unit, we'll be focusing on how it affected specifically African Americans. When studying this movement, you'll look at how the social, political, and economic factors all played a major role in making the Civil Rights Act of 1964 a reality. You'll learn about big problems like slavery, Jim Crow laws, and systemic discrimination. Also, we're going to explore key events and milestones that define the civil rights movement. You'll learn about events such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, and also pivotal legislation such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you'll gain an understanding about the ideas that are still vital today, such as justice, equality, and civic duty. So let's jump in here. First up, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So these are known as the Reconstruction Amendments, and they were all passed between 1865 and 1970, 5 years immediately following the Civil War. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. It was ratified in 1865. 14th Amendment, which requires equal protection under the law to all persons, ratified in 1868. And the 15th Amendment, which bans racial discrimination in voting, is ratified in 1870. So some questions to think about is, as we're going through, this portion of the lesson would be, in what ways do you believe the 13th Amendment has influenced modern discussions about civil rights and racial equality? So we'll dive into that. How do the concepts of citizenship and equal protection of the law, as outlined in the 14th Amendment, shape current debates about immigration and civil rights? And so here we go. Here is a quick video about the Reconstruction Amendments that are explained. Feel free to listen, take notes. Here we go.
When the U.S. was first founded, you had what were called slave states and free states. Most of the free states were in the north, while most of the slave states were in the south. This was because of how different each state's economy was. Southern states' economies were largely based on plantations that relied heavily on slaves, while the north was heavily industrialized and didn't rely on slaves. When the U.S. admitted new states to the Union, each new state could opt to be a free state or a slave state. As the U.S. admitted more states to the Union, there was a balancing act to ensure that there were an equal amount of slave states and free states. After several events of abolitionists clashing with anti-abolitionists, tensions only continued to rise. Abraham Lincoln being elected into office in 1860 was the final straw for the South, so they seceded from the Union and they formed the Confederate States of America. This put America into a war that lasted just shy of 4 years. The Reconstruction Amendments were 3 amendments that were a result of the Civil War, meant to end slavery, provide equal rights, and voting rights to African Americans. The 13th Amendment bans slavery with the exception if someone is convicted of a crime. It was proposed by Congress after fears that the Emancipation Proclamation would not be enough. The 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865. Though the 13th Amendment banned slavery, this didn't guarantee rights to former slaves. So that's where the 14th and 15th Amendment come in. The 14th Amendment forces all government officials to respect equal rights of African Americans and former slaves. The 14th Amendment also banned anyone who rebelled against the United States from being elected to political office or joining the military unless they were removed of such a disability by 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. The 14th Amendment was ratified on July 9, 1868. The 15th Amendment granted voting rights to people regardless of skin color, thus allowing African Americans the right to vote. This amendment was put forth partly because of how the South was likely to have more seats in Congress thanks to the 3/5 compromise no longer in effect. The 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3, 1870. Although these amendments were ratified in the late 1800s, African Americans did not enjoy equal rights granted by these amendments. Poor interpretations by the Supreme Court, along with things such as Jim Crow laws, made it next to impossible for a lot of African Americans to vote, especially in the South. It would not be until another 100 years before the rights of the 14th and 15th Amendments would start to be enforced. Political Minute out.
So notice it talked about the Jim Crow laws and how it didn't all happen right away. So despite the 14th Amendment, Southern states were still able to legally segregate black and white children in schools. There was a concept called separate but equal. The U.S. Supreme Court decision from 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson happened because a gentleman by the name of Homer Plessy, who was a black man, tried to sit in a whites-only train car. The court ruled that as long as black and white people were treated equally, they could be separated by race. So even though they were treated equally, they could be separated, meaning that there was a white car and a black car. So they called this separate but equal. But separate but equal wasn't truly equal. Conditions in the places meant for black people were usually much worse than those for white people. For instance, look at schools. Black schools often had leaking roofs, sagging floors, windows without even glass in it. They were overcrowded with a high teacher-to-student ratio. There was too many students and not enough desks, and not enough books. And if the books were available, they were old or outdated, the outdated ones that were passed along from the white schools. So we'll look at that. We're going to look at this segregation as African Americans across the country saw firsthand the impact of segregated and inferior educational practices on black students. Look at this map here. Educational segregation in the U.S. prior to Brown versus Board of Education. You have required, you have no legislation, optional, limited, forbidden. See right here, you can see the disparities in the map. So with that being said, led by the NAACP's Charles Hamilton Houston, the NAACP began mounting a legal challenge to separate but equal provision in the 1940s. And Houston actually became known as the man who killed Jim Crow, which we'll look into. He trained several attorneys, one including Thurgood Marshall, who we'll cover. He trained Thurgood Marshall to serve as counsel for African Americans to fight the end of segregation in things such as education, in transportation, and in housing. And in 1951, the NAACP took on a case with a plaintiff named Oliver Brown. This became a landmark case, actually. So you'll need to know this, so make sure you're taking notes. Oliver Brown's daughter, who was 8 years old, Linda Brown, was refused enrollment at the elementary school that was closest to their home in Topeka, Kansas. And instead, she was forced to ride a bus to a segregated black school that was miles and miles away. So a class action lawsuit was filed, and it was Brown versus the Board of Education. And this was alleging that its segregation policy was unconstitutional. So here you'll think about questions, we'll brainstorm. I'll have you guys think about things such as how did the NAACP help shape the strategies of the civil rights movement and help advance racial equality in the United States. Then in May of 1954, in a unanimous opinion, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education and overturned Plessy and declared that separate schools are inherently unequal, and that separating children in public schools on the basis of race was, in fact, unconstitutional. So it actually signaled the end of legalized racial segregation in schools. However, and this is where it gets tricky, and we'll dive into this as well, The court delays deciding on how to implement the decision and asks for another round of arguments. So many schools, in fact, remain segregated. How are we going to implement this? So, questions to ask would be, do changes in law actually promote changes in society? So then in 55, what they call Brown 2, the Supreme Court actually ordered the lower federal courts to require desegregation with all deliberate speed, is what they called it, with all deliberate speed. So between 55 and 60, federal judges held more than 200 school desegregation hearings. So we're going to ask ourselves, how did the Supreme Court's decision in Brown 2 address the challenges of implementing desegregation in public schools? And why was there so much resistance to desegregation after the Brown decision? You would think it was legal. You would think more people want to get on board. But people get stuck in their ways. We will discuss. In 1955, August 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old from Chicago, was brutally murdered in Mississippi for allegedly flirting with a white woman. His murderers were acquitted, and the case brought international attention to the civil rights movement after Jet magazine published a photo of Till's beaten body in an open casket funeral. So, a question here that we'll look into is, how did this tragic story of Emmett Till, how did the trial and the media coverage influence the civil rights movement? How could this example of media coverage expand on future issues, things that we do here? Because now we have more media coverage, with the internet and with social media. So how can the media influence change? We also have in 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks, an African-American woman who was arrested and fined, all because she refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. So this is something to look at, because then this actually sparked off the Montgomery bus boycott. Her defiant stance actually prompted the bus boycott, and it lasted almost a year. So approximately 40,000 black bus riders, who are the majority of the city bus riders, boycotted the system, and good for them. And that afternoon, black leaders met to form the Montgomery Improvement Association, also known as MIA, and that group elected Martin Luther King Jr. as its president, and decided to continue the boycott until the city met its demands. So in 1956, a Montgomery federal court ruled that any law requiring racially segregated seating on buses indeed violated the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So we're going to dig in and ask questions such as, how did Rosa Parks act in defiance, and her role in the Montgomery bus boycott contribute to the broader civil rights movement? And what does her story tell us about the power of individual actions in affecting social change? And then next in the lesson, we're going to look at the Little Rock Nine, who were 9 African-American students. And when they arrived at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, they made their way through a crowd that was shouting obscenities and throwing objects at them. And when they finally reached the front door, the National Guard actually prevented them from entering the school, so they were forced to go home. So President Dwight D. Eisenhower actually ordered the federal troops to escort the students into the classroom. So they were actually finally able to go. They were protected by federal troops. So questions we'll ask here is, in what ways did the story of the Little Rock Nine highlight the challenges of implementing school desegregation? And what did the intervention of the National Guard in the Little Rock Nine event show about the complexity of federal and state authority in the fight for civil rights? At one point, do the states have to listen to federal law? So in 1957, President Eisenhower once again sent Congress a proposal for the civil rights legislation. The result, it was actually a Civil Rights Act of 1957. And this is a precursor to what we'll study later. And it was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Laid the groundwork for future civil rights legislation. It also established the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The 1957 Act aimed to protect African American voting rights, and it brought the issue of racial discrimination to the attention of everyone. And so it signaled to the civil rights movement that progress could be made. And also it included an increased federal involvement, as we talked about with the federal versus state. So we'll jump into there. Because largely prior to this, federal government had a hands-off approach to racial discrimination, leaving everything more to the state and local levels. In 1960, we'll also look at 4 African American college students who in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to leave a whites-only lunch counter without being served. These were inspired by nonviolent protests from Gandhi. And so the Greenboro sit-in, as it became to be called, actually sparked similar sit-ins throughout the city and in many other states. So we'll, read more into this. How did the Greensboro 4 sit-in strategy during the 60s demonstrate the power of non-violent protests? And in what ways do you think the methods and impact of peaceful protests today are the same, or how do they differ from that event? And then we're going to really dive into this. In August of 63, more than 250,000 people participated in the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, gathered near the Lincoln Memorial, and Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. And in the speech, King called for civil and economic rights and the end of racism in the United States overall. In 64, King won the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality throughout nonviolent resistance. And then we'll also talk about the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. So, things we'll look at here is what are the natural rights and principles that Dr. King used to inform his leadership of the civil rights movement? How was he so effective with his nonviolent protests? And let's see, here is the quick version of the speech. We will actually dissect the entire speech as a whole later on, but here's a quick, I think it's a minute and a half.
Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Okay, very powerful. And we're going to look at the entire speech as a whole and, kind of dissect it. So then Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was signed by President Johnson, declaring racial discrimination illegal. It outlaws discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin in public accommodations such as employment and federally funded programs. It was the most sweeping civil rights legislation Congress has ever passed. And it paved the way for things such as Fair Housing Act of 68 or Americans with Disabilities in 1990. We'll look at things such as, I'll ask you questions such as how did Plessy versus Ferguson outcome and Brown versus Board of Education affect the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then also, as I just mentioned, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act was signed into law in August of 65 by President Lyndon Johnson, and it outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many of the southern states, especially after the Civil War. So Congress adopted the law to ensure that the states followed the 15th Amendment's guarantee that the right to vote was not denied because of race. So, how do you think the Voting Rights Act of 1965 still influences voting rights and political participation in the U.S. today? How is it affecting voting today in regards to Democrats versus Republicans? Who's allowed to vote? Who's not allowed to vote? So we're going to look into that. So at the end of this lesson, a couple weeks from now, we'll be having some assessments, obviously. I'm going to actually be breaking you guys up into groups, and you guys are going to do some presentations. Then shortly after, we'll have a unit exam. So you'll be able to use certain outlines and charts on the exam, and that you will make during the group presentations. So make sure that you are helping each other and you're participating and asking me questions that you may have. You're also going to be able to use this PowerPoint as a graphic organizer. in regards to the presentations, so on Monday, I'll split up the class up into groups of 4. Actually, not this Monday, but next Monday. And then each group, so you're going to pick a major event that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, anywhere between 1954 and 1969. And you will then have a couple days in class to research with your groups about what happened and why and why it was important for the Civil Rights Movement. I'll be walking around. I'll be answering questions as needed, and also I'll help you guys fill out. I'm going to give you guys two graphic organizer. The first being a basic outline as to what to look for while researching, and the second being a KWL chart that we've used in the past, obviously, within the group. So, and you guys can use the internet, videos, books. You can ask parents. You can ask myself, or any resource that you feel that you may need. Then each group will present on that Friday. You'll have about 5 to 10 minutes to present, and you can use videos. You can make a PowerPoint, a PDF. You can sing a song. You can act out a skit. But everyone in the group must participate. And then we'll have a class discussion about the presentation and mix in what we learned with also what we read from our textbooks. And then, on the following week, we'll have the unit exam, which you will be able to have ample time to study for. And like I said, there will be certain things that you will be able to use there on the exam. All right, so let me stop sharing here. So that's pretty much what we're going to be doing for the next couple weeks. So let's get started. If everyone wants to pull out their textbooks, and we'll turn to page 147.